Cloud migration is one of those topics that gets talked about like it's automatically a good idea. Move to the cloud, become more agile, reduce costs, improve resilience, modernize the business. All sounds clean, strategic and inevitable, and on paper it makes perfect sense. But the truth is a lot of migrations are broken long before that first workload ever gets moved. It's not because Azure is the problem, not because the cloud doesn't actually work, but because the way organizations approach migration is often completely wrong. They treat it like a technical relocation exercise when in reality it's a business, operational, architectural and culture shift all happening at once. And when that gets oversimplified, things start to unravel. So in this video I want to give you an honest version, not the polished presentation version, not the vendor version, the real version. Because cloud migration absolutely can be the right move, but the way it gets sold, the way it gets scoped and executed in a lot of organizations is still badly broken. The reason cloud migration creates so much frustration is because the promise and the reality often feel like really miles apart, right? At the beginning, everyone's excited. The business hears words like agility, innovation, scalability and cost optimization. Leadership sees a strategic move. IT sees a chance to get away from that aging infrastructure. Vendors see a major transformation opportunity. And nobody wants to be the person in the room saying, hang on a minute, are we actually clear why we're actually doing this? So the momentum builds, and what often happens next is that migration becomes the objective instead of the outcome. That's where everything starts to go wrong, because move it to Azure it's not a strategy, right? It's not even really a plan. It's a direction, and if you don't fill in everything underneath that direction properly, the cloud just becomes a new place to carry old problems. I've seen environments where organizations moved workloads into the cloud and technically succeeded. Systems were running, users could connect, everything looked like it had been delivered, but 6 months later the environment was more expensive, harder to govern, and no easier to support than what they had before. That's not a cloud problem. That's a migration problem. This is probably the biggest issue of all. A lot of cloud migration conversations start with the question, what are we moving? Or which workloads can go first? But the more important question, the one that often doesn't even get depth, is why are we actually doing this? That sounds really basic, but it changes everything. Because the real objective is cost reduction. That leads to one type of decision making. If the real objective is resilience, that leads to another. If the real objective is getting away from unsupported infrastructure, that's different again. If the real objective is enabling faster delivery for development teams, that's another completely different migration shape. And the problem is that organizations often bundle all these objectives together and call it cloud migration, as if it's one simple thing. And halfway through the project, different stakeholders start pulling in different directions because they were never actually aligned on what success meant in the first place. A really common scenario looks like this. Okay, leadership says they want to modernize and reduce costs. The infrastructure team hears reduce legacy footprint. The architecture team hears build for future scale. The operations team hears please don't break everything. And finance hears this should be cheaper than what we have now. Now everyone is involved in the same program, but they're all measuring success differently. That's how migrations become messy before any workloads even move. Right, let me be a bit more direct here. Okay, so a lot of so-called cloud migrations are not actually transformation projects, right? They're just infrastructure moves with new branding. Servers that once ran in data centers now run in Azure. The application hasn't changed. The operational model hasn't changed. The governance hasn't matured enough. The security model is often still catching up. The architecture's usually still shaped around the old environment. But because the workloads are now in the cloud, everyone talks about it like something fundamentally progressive has actually happened. And sometimes, to be fair, that move is still valid. Right? If the goal is to exit a data center or avoid a hardware refresh, lift and shift can be a sensible transitional step. Okay? The issue is when people pretend that relocation equals modernization. It doesn't. If you move a badly understood, badly governed, poorly documented workload into Azure, you don't get cloud native environment. You get a badly understood, badly governed, poorly documented Azure workload, right? The complexity didn't disappear. Just change postcode. That's where a lot of disappointment comes from. The business expected transformation, the project delivered migration. Those are not the same thing. This is one of the truths that doesn't get enough airtime in my opinion. A lot of organizations think that moving to the cloud will reduce complexity because they're no longer managing physical infrastructure. And in some ways, yes, the cloud does simplify certain things, right? You gain elasticity, managed services, and faster deployment capabilities, right? That is actually a real thing. Fair enough. But it also exposes weakness much faster. When governance is weak, Azure makes that visible through sprawl, inconsistent tagging, unclear ownership, and uncontrolled cost. If your identity model is messy, that gets more painful in a cloud environment, not less. If your teams are not aligned on responsibility, the cloud amplifies that confusion because change happens faster and at a larger scale. A good example here is cost, right? On-premises environments had a lot of inefficiency because once the hardware is purchased, the problem becomes blurry. In Azure, inefficiency becomes visible very, very quickly, right? Idle compute, oversized environments, poor scaling logic, unnecessary tension and duplicated services, they all start showing up, directly in that bill. Some organizations interpret that as the cloud is expensive. Sometimes it is. But very often what they're actually seeing is the cost of their own poor design or weak operational discipline. We're just exposed more clearly than before. That's why cloud migration can feel harsher than expected. The platform makes it easier to move fast, but it also removes a lot of hiding places organizations used to rely on. Another big reason cloud migration breaks down is because organizations frame it as a technical exercise when the reality is much, much bigger than that. Technology absolutely matters, architecture matters, security matters, landing zones, identity, I can go on, right? Workload design, networking and monitoring, they all matter. But if that's the only lens you actually apply, you actually miss the real reasons migrations struggle. Because the real friction is often elsewhere. It's in ownership, it's in decision making, it's in whether the operations team is ready to support the new platform. It's in whether the security team is aligned early on or they're brought in once the design is already set. It's in whether the people funding the migration actually understand what the cloud operating model means after go live. I've seen projects where the Azure build itself was technically sound, right? But the organization still struggled because nobody had thought properly about who would own the environment afterwards. Was it infrastructure? Was it cloud ops? Was it engineering? Was it a managed service partner? Was it shared? Nobody had a clear answer. So the migration succeeded technically and it still created chaos operationally. That's why I always say cloud migration is not just about where the workloads run. It's about whether the organization can actually function in the model it's moving into. Have you ever been in one of those meetings where everyone keeps saying we need to move to the cloud, but nobody can clearly explain what success actually looks like? You already know why this topic actually matters. And if you like this kind of content, the honest version, the stuff that people usually only admit after the project has gone sideways, make sure to hit that subscribe button, right? Because this is actually the type of Microsoft Cloud conversation I want to keep building on this channel. This is the part that I think people miss the most. The cloud is often sold like a destination. Get there, and the organization becomes more modern, more efficient, more scalable, more secure. But really the cloud it's not the destination. Right? It's the environment in which your existing organizational quality becomes much more obvious. If your teams, are good at automation, governance, observability, access control, continuous improvement, stuff like that, the cloud amplifies that in a positive way. If they're weak in those areas, the cloud amplifies that as well, right? And that's why treating a migration like a one-time project is such a mistake. Because even if you sort of finish the migration, the real work starts afterwards. Day 2 in the cloud matters as much as day 1, sometimes even more. Once the workloads are there, you need to control cost. That operating standards as well, you need to control the governance, you need to monitor. Lifecycle management is really important. Make sure you're refining the security and real ownership. If you haven't prepared for that shift, then you haven't really prepared for cloud migration. If you've just prepared for cloud relocation, that's a very, very different thing. This is where I'm going to be even more opinionated, right? So sometimes the cloud is absolutely the right strategic direction, but the organization is not ready to move at the pace it wants. And instead of acknowledging that honestly, teams push ahead anyway because nobody wants to look, unambitious. They don't look resistant and, not modern enough. That creates a really dangerous dynamic. A business can be committed to Azure as a long-term direction and still not be ready to migrate certain workloads right now. That's not failure, that's actually maturity. But too many migrations are driven by pressure rather than readiness. There's pressure from vendors, pressure from leadership, pressure from budget cycles, pressure from legacy deadlines, pressure to show progress. So workloads get moved before dependencies are properly understood, right? Before operations are actually ready. There's no governance that's established. And even before the target architecture is clear enough to support them. That's when the migration becomes a success story in PowerPoint and a support burden in reality. Sometimes the most responsible cloud decision is not move now. Sometimes it's not yet, and here's why. That's a much harder sentence to say in enterprise environments than it should be. If I had to define what good cloud migration looks like, I'd say it's not the fastest project, and it's not the one with the most workloads moved in the shortest period of time. The good ones usually feel slower, especially at the beginning, right? They ask harder questions. They spend more time being clear on objectives. They separate relocation from real modernization. They design the target environment intentionally, and they bring operations, security, and governance into the conversation earlier instead of bottling them and bolting them on later on. And most importantly, they treat migration as part of a longer capability shift. That means success is measured not just by did the system move, but by is this environment now easier to manage, easier to secure, and better aligned to what the organization actually needs. That's the test. If the answer is no, then just being in Azure doesn't really mean very much. So, if you take one thing away from this final video, let it be this. Cloud migration is not broken because the cloud is broken. It's broken because organizations still approach it as a technical move instead of a strategic, operational, and architectural shift. The cloud can absolutely deliver speed, flexibility, resilience, and better operating models, but only if the migration is grounded in real clarity about why the move is happening, what the target state actually needs to look like, and whether the organization is ready to operate in that model once it gets there. Otherwise, you just end up being, with the same problems in a more expensive and more visible place. And that's the truth people don't say nearly enough. So in my next video, I'm actually going to be changing shift a little bit. This last probably 10 episodes have been very much, or 10 videos have been very much around AVD, Windows 365, architecture of that, auto scaling, things like that. But this cloud migration piece actually is going to kind of put me onto, I'm going to go a bit of a different angle now. I'm actually going to start talking about I'm a cloud solutions architect, I'm a cloud consultant. And the content I'm going to do is very much about how those engagements happen, right? How to interact with customers, and also how to design and implement successful cloud architecture and operations and migrations. So if you like that type of content, make sure to hit that subscribe button, make sure you like, and drop me a comment with any of the topics you want to see in my videos. I do appreciate everyone's support. Thanks for watching, see you on the next one.